good evening. I'm Melisa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. A proposal meant to study local governance in Kuala Lumpur has quickly become a national flashpoint. The idea of electing KL's mayor has sparked objections over race and political control even before any formal reform is even on the table. So tonight, let's separate fear from fact and examine what electing a mayor for KL would actually involve. Joining me on the show to help us think this through is Danesh Prakash Chacko, who is the Chairperson of Persatuan Bertindak, Pilihan, Raya, Bebas dan Saksama, better known as Tindak. Danesh, thank you so much for being on the show with me today. So let's start with the basics. What does electing a mayor for KL actually why are we looking at this? What problem are we trying to solve by electing a mayor for KL?
First of all, I would like to thank you for inviting me for today's show. Now, the question is about the purpose of electing the mayor of Kuala Lumpur and why did we have reached this stage. First of all, we have to acknowledge Kuala Lumpur. It's not only just the federal capital of the country, but also have a significant amount of population whereby they only elect the members of parliament, but they do not have the say for the city council or the city hall, to be specific, for Bebas, that is DBKL. So currently we have a situation whereby the head of the DBKL, informally we can call it the mayor, or Dato Banda officially, is appointed. And if you have an issue with DBKL, by right you should have dealt DBKL directly. But because there is no channel of accountability between DBKL and the citizens or even voters of Kuala Lumpur, that means the only option if you want to raise a complaint and to see some sort of action is you end up dealing with the members of parliament, right? Which is out of their scope, but the members of parliament becomes the intermediary. So what we're trying to address here is to create a channel of accountability, both either direct or indirect or both, between the city governance and the citizens or voters of Kuala Lumpur.
Okay, so why is KL different from other states, or is it different from other states? Is it because of its status as a federal territory, therefore there is this element of maybe electing a KL mayor? The reason I'm asking is I think we need to separate in our minds whether this is part of the third vote, whether this is part of local elections. And we all know local elections in Malaysia has a complicated history.
Personally, I wouldn't want to see it differently, so I will not go in the same angle as you have posed. So, of course, the only difference I would say is Kuala Lumpur is, instead of calling as a third vote, it becomes a second vote. Because Kuala Lumpur's, how you want to see governance-wise, you can see from two options. Either you create effectively something like what you see the adjacent states you would have, like a Dewan Undangan, right? Or you just change the existing DBKL structure to facilitate local elections. So I would say if we go down that path, your second vote is actually a third vote. So we have to tie it as the wider push that we need of accountable local government, so which is lacking in the current framework in Kuala Lumpur. So this is why I would say we should tie this thing as a wider push for local government. And for your information, that Local Government Elections Act 1960, when it was finally came to effect through the elections of various local councils in 1961, which happens to be this year, the 65th anniversary, where did we start? We started with the major town councils. Okay, obviously, unfortunately speaking, Kuala Lumpur was not part of this equation because the Federal Capital Act 1960 pretty much said you are excluded from all elections. So we can push for local elections through the major councils. And if Dewan Bandaraya Kuala Lumpur, which is the peak of all the councils, can pioneer that, that would be fantastic.
Can you elaborate a little bit more about that, Danesh? If we were to think about the broader structure for KL, what would that look like, having an elected council, having an elected mayor? How do we make local government genuinely accountable? Is it just about electing a mayor, or can we make the entire local government of the entire DBKL more democratic, more accountable to its people?
So one of the big challenges we have right now with Kuala Lumpur is there's a push towards the mayoral part, the Dato' Bandar election. But then we missed out the other part is, okay, who is accountable to? Right now, through the appointment, you can say he's accountable to the one who he appoints, which is the Minister of Federal Territories, which happens to be part of the ruling government of the day. So that's that form of accountability. But let's say you introduce a direct election for the mayor. So yes, he's accountable to the voters. But what happens if he does things that are not aligned to the desires of the voters? There's no check and balance. So the problem with the DBKL right now is they just only have an advisory board, a Lembaga Penasihat, which is composed from last I check around 15 members. So what Kuala Lumpur needs to, as a DBKL per se, has to align is what you see, let's say, in the other city councils, a councillor system, whereby you can have a separate election for elected mayor and a separate elections for elected councillors. Because the councillors can cover different sections of Kuala Lumpur. So they could be the first channel of accountability between you and the voter. Right? So we have to see from a perspective that while it's good to push for mayoral elections, but if you do not introduce a councillor system, right now there's a talk about some MPs, okay, let's have a councillor system whereby it should be appointed by the members of parliament or something along the lines, right? Why don't we just talk about amending the Federal Capital Act, City of Kuala Lumpur Act 1971, so that you have the councillor system, but why don't we just bring the elections right away? If you start going through the appointment process, then I think it's just reproducing what we have right now.
Okay. Well, one of the reasons why I think there is this proposal to have maybe an MP, to begin with, maybe an MP appointed mayor, then later elected councillors, is that it's more, I guess, palatable to the public. The recurring concern is that local elections in urban areas could heighten ethnic polarization. Can you, I'm sure you've done research, Tindak has done research on this, has spoken about this many times. What do you understand and what does the research tell us about that risk?
Okay, so now one of the constant recurring theme about the opposition towards elections is because of the ethnic tensions that might come into play. So let's just narrow down specifically for Kuala Lumpur. So based on our research, during the 1974 elections, where for the first time, the Kuala Lumpur constituencies were first contested under federal territory. At that time, 61.9% of the voters were Chinese, 27.35% were Malays, and around 10.68% were Indians. So if you bring the local government elections at that time, then people would say, or you will end up resulting, let's say, a Chinese mayor would be elected. But let's look at the situation of 2022, right? 47% of the voters of Kuala Lumpur are Chinese. So it's a dramatic decline from 61 to 47. Then the Malays is 38.29%, which is an increase from 27.35%. And the Indians is more or less the same amount, 11.13%. So right now your concern is if you bring an election, you might have a mayor of a different ethnicity to govern the city. But the reality is Kuala Lumpur is right now is a mixed area. No, it's no community commands an outright 50%. Maybe slightly in the future, the Malays will command the 50%. So this issue about ethnic tensions caused by elections is misplaced. And sad to say, it is used a weapon to cause a division. So now the question is, how do we address this? We need to talk about a different electoral system at play. For your information, when we talk about local elections, we refer to the Local Government Elections Act 1960. And what is interesting, what we found out based on the research that Tindak has done, is that Local Government Elections Act 1960 has spelled out the possibility of two different electoral systems. And it has been implemented before, so whereby you can still retain the first past the post system, NPTP, where the candidate who wins the most number of votes wins the area, right? But at the same time, they have this concept called multi-member wards. Maybe a part of Kuala Lumpur can have elect three councillors. Yeah, I'm using that as an example. Of course, if you strictly refer the Local Government Elections Act 1960, even if it is multi-member ward, it doesn't necessarily yield a proportional because there's this thing called block voting that came to implementation for multi-member ward. But my point is, if you refer to the Local Government Elections Act 1960, there is a possibility that we can amend some of the rules, and this is just within the realm of the Act, whereby we can have single member, maybe single member wards and multi-member wards operating side by side. And if you want to have a separate mayoral election, then we can introduce that concept through the Local Government Elections Act 1960 that for the mayor or the Dato Bantar or the Yang Dipertua, you shall elect them not necessarily by first past the post system, but let's say a two-round system or any other electoral system which is appropriate if you want to make a distinction of electing the mayor and the councillors. But if we go by the premise that the mayor shall be first among the equals, means among the councillors, then we can look at using Local Government Elections Act to amend some of the elements to introduce different electoral system. And we are not bound per se to the federal constitution.
Oh, that's very interesting. Just very quickly, Danesh, can I just ask you what kind of, I guess, public understanding or civic readiness do you think is needed to take this next step? I'm just wondering how the ordinary KL resident who may be unsure about whether local elections is a good idea, whether electing a mayor, electing a councillors is a good idea, how it would improve their lives. What would you tell them? What would you say to them, Danesh?
So to my fellow KL voters who have only one choice during an election and you're left with the choice for 5 years, I think it is time for you to understand that you as a voter in KL actually seem to have less power compared to everyone else because you just go across Salam. Yeah, at least you have a choice to even elect your second vote. Kuala Lumpur, you don't. And historically, Kuala Lumpur had that choice. Of course, you can choose the Selangor state government. At that time, when Kuala Lumpur was part of it, by the same time, you had the choice to elect your government for the city of Kuala Lumpur. I think it's time that for all of you to understand it's not about ethnicity. It's not about the concerns of criminal underlings. By the way, that's a new argument that has just came about against proposed Kuala Lumpur. It's about accountability because Kuala Lumpur has a lot of challenges. You have to treat it as though it's like a mini country of its own. If you separate it out, you can consider it's a developed country of its own. You need to have a say about the future of planning, the future of the city's response to climate change, and everything else in between, right? And the other aspect that you might be concerned, and if you ask me this legitimately, is who becomes the voters of Kuala Lumpur? Because actually, if you follow Local Government Elections Act, interestingly, they have this very outdated old concept that if you're an owner of a property, you can be a voter. So I think that needs to be addressed. If you're concerned about this, then I think this is where it should be addressed through the Local Government Elections Act, where we had to put aside or remove that sort of concept. As well, just use the existing electoral roll for all the Kuala Lumpur constituencies. And okay, I've been voting for, let's say, Bukit Bintang Segambut, so I also become a voter for Kuala Lumpur elections. And I think when we have an elected leadership for Kuala Lumpur, then the people that you should deal with for day-to-day issues will no longer be your MPs. Right? And the MPs should be freed up to do other things. You should be dealing with DBKL with an understanding that they are accountable to you now. Right now, you can send emails, you can call them, but they can ignore you, and there's no consequence because fundamentally they're not accountable to you. But with elections, There's an accountability, and you know who to deal with. And the person you deal with really for this sort of issues day to day is DPKL, not the MPs.
Right. Danesh, thank you so much for being on the show with me. Danesh Prakash Chacko from the Electoral Reform Group, Tindak. We're going to take a quick break here and consider this. We'll be back with more. Stay tuned. Hi, welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. Let's continue our discussion about the proposal to study electing Kuala Lumpur's mayor and why even the idea of it has settled some political quarters. Joining me on the show is Dr Lim Mah Hui, who is a member of Penang Forum and a former Penang Island City Councillor. Dr Lim, thank you so much for joining me on the show today. So I'm just wondering, from your experience from inside a city council, what do you think are the biggest misconceptions the public might have about just how much power local leaders actually hold?
Thank you for having me on the show, Melissa. Yes, in theory, city councillors have more power than state assembly person. Yeah, invested with more power. But in practice, they practically have none. And this is because the state authorities are the ones that are appointing the city councillors, right? And once they are appointed, they can also be dismissed at the discretion of the chief minister or the state. And hence, many of them do not dare to exercise their power, right? They become obedient servants of the political masters.
Okay, so not that much power. The idea of having, now that we're talking about a proposal to elect KL mayor, and some have used this as calls for maybe to relook the wider system, even think about local government elections, now they're having the third vote be reinstated. I want to talk to you a little bit about the discourse that has come out in the past few weeks. Some quarters are concerned that urban elections or local government elections inevitably become ethnic contests. And I'd like you to maybe respond to that. How would you respond to those concerns?
Yeah, this is actually one of the biggest concerns in the discourse or discussion on local elections. That the myth is especially peddled by the opposition in past, and to some extent, even actually within the administration now, the Barisan Nasional, is that UMNO basically, that if there was local elections, the non-Bumi Putras would dominate over this whole landscape because they are the majority in the cities. That may be the case in one or two cities. But if we look at the real statistics, we find that of the about 151 or 50 local councils throughout Malaysia, of which there are 3 city halls. That's basically like Putrajaya, Labuan, and Kuala Lumpur, right? Bumi Putras form the majority, more than 50% of the voters in 2 out of these 3 city councils. That means there are 67% of them. There are 9 city councils in the whole of Malaysia, and the Bumi Putras form the majority of voters in 67% of these 9 city councils. And when you go down to the lower levels of municipal councils, of which there are 37, 84% of these 87%, that means basically around 45 or so of these city councils are Malay majority. And then when you go to the district council, 94%, that means 90 out of 94 of these district councils are Malay majority. So there is no way that the non-Bumi Putras can dominate this this local election.
Right.
And I think this is basically a race mongering for the politicians to continue the system of appointments and abuse of privileges and powers, where we see many of the mayors and city councillors, because they're not accountable to people, they put their hands in the till and they've been brought to court with a lot of charges, and some of them have, unfortunately, been dismissed.
Right. Beyond the racial component, do you see this as a contest for political power as well?
Yeah, definitely. Because what happens is that when you have the election at the local council, as I said, that the local councillors have more power than the state. The state has only one or two sources of revenue, basically quit rent, and they have power over religious issue and all this. But most of the powers are resting in the local council. So when the local councillors take their proper positions, then the state becomes quite superfluous. And that's the problem. They do not, because the chief ministers do not want to give up their power to be able to appoint their own people to run the council.
Right. Dr. Lim, you talked about the data showing the majority of Bumiputra voters. Can you talk to me about how the first past the post system plays into this? How should we understand this if we were to look at the way our electoral system is structured?
Yes. Unfortunately, our electoral system follows the British system, which is called first past the post, or actually better even to see winners take all. For example, if there are 4 political parties contesting in an election, right? And 3 political parties each get, say, 20% of the votes. So the total, they account for 60% of the votes. But then the 4th political party gets, say, 40% of the votes, or even 30% of the votes, right? Let's say 10% are spoiled. What happens is that 30% of the votes is more than the other 3, which is 20, 20, 20 each. So this 4th political party, which has only 30% of the votes, now take all the seats, because it's the winners take all. Whereas if you move to a proportional representation, then the smaller parties that capture smaller amount of votes, they still have a good chance of being represented in either the parliament or the state assembly or the local council. Let me illustrate with one example. In 2018 state election of Penang, right? Penang State Assembly has 40 seats. What happened then was that in that year, the Pakatan Harapan captured 67% of the total votes. But they captured 93% of the seats in the State Assembly, right? Whereas the Barisan, which captured 22% of the total votes, had only 2 seats in the State Assembly, that's 5%. And PAS, which had 10% of the total voters supporting them, had only 1 seat, which is 2.5% of the total number of seats. This means that, it is very much against the interest of the smaller parties who voters want to see, elected, but they are shut out. If they had moved to a proportional representation system, then the 2018 elections would see in the distribution of seats in the State Assembly that the Pakatan Harapan would have 27 seats instead of 37, and the Barisan will have 9 seats instead of 2, and PAS would have 4 seats instead of 1. So it is to the advantage of, the opposition and smaller parties to push for proportional representation. And I think there's no better way than to introduce this concept, into our political system than through the local council elections, because
Right.
this is like a carte blanche. We can do
Right.
it.
Dr. Lim, the conversation, the discourse around the KL mayoral elections has just been that, focusing on electing one person as KL mayor. Can I ask you what you envisage of this this election? Do you see it as maybe a part of a wider conversation about restoring local government elections? And how do we make sure that, an elected mayor doesn't become too powerful, too politicized, without having strong checks and balances?
Yeah. I welcome this initiative and a study at the moment to introduce the mayoral election. It's high time we do that. In many cities in the world, Jakarta, Seoul, New York, and all that, people elect their mayors, and they want to see their mayors accountable to them, not accountable to some political masters sitting in the Putrajaya. So that's very important, right? So we have direct mayoral election, but it cannot be just the mayoral election. That's what I think the discussion has been. I read in the newspaper, and I don't see any discussion about what about the city councillors, right? I mean, you can't have the mayor having concentrate all the powers into one person. That would be very unhealthy. So I think, and that's what most cities in the world do when they have mayoral elections. They also have city council, local council election, and you don't incur extra money because you, instead of just sticking on one sheet of paper, you have two sheets of paper where you elect, the councillors, and at the same time you elect the mayor. So, and that's very important because then the city councillors can act as a sounding board and as a check and balance, against the mayors. And again, I think it's very important, and I hope this study does, that they study the practices of the different cities, and we choose the best practice, where you give certain amount of, quite a lot of power to the mayor to initiate the budget, to initiate the direction that he wants to see, his vision of the city and where he wants to go. But then his budget must be passed by the city councillors, right? And some cities, the mayor have a veto vote, right? But you can check that too by saying that if you have 2/3 of the city councillors opposing the veto, then the veto can be overturned. So I mean, there are a lot of ways to do this in a creative way.
Definitely, there are ways to provide those checks and balances. Dr. Lim, thank you so much for your time. Dr. Lim Mah Hui there, wrapping up this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching, and good night.